You're listening to ARC.
At any rate, you can see how many things would need to be talked about if I were to give you the story of Australopithecus africanus. So many things are intertwined and tangled in.
This is the voice of Raymond Dart. And he's right. So many things are intertwined and tangled and had to happen exactly right in order for this story to play out the way it did. A Goldilocks moment. From exactly where and when the Taung Child died, to the climatic and geological conditions shaping the landscape over millions of years. But it wasn't just the geological conditions that had to be just right. There were lots of other cogs that needed to move into position for the child to be discovered and Raymond Dart to win his glory. And one of those steps was the exact timing of Raymond Dart's arrival to South Africa in 1922.
To come to work, to be in Johannesburg, Africans need a permit. Without their permits or their passbooks, they can be arrested and detained at will.
The country was deeply shaped by centuries of colonial rule, and racial segregation was being further entrenched. A law, the new Native Urban Areas Act, would be introduced soon after his arrival. This meant no black South African could live in a white area unless they were working for a white employer. And the biggest employer of all of them, and central to the story, was the mines. This is the second episode of Unburied Season 2, about who actually discovered the Taung Child and why it took several decades for the scientific establishment to accept that this would change evolutionary history forever. We call this episode Pride and Prejudice. My name is Rasmus Spitz.
The cry was gold, and from all over the world, in Britain, Germany, France, Russia, from the American far west, from Bulgaria, Latvia, Bosnia, and who knows where, the whole high-spirited ram-dazzle of professional diggerdom, the dreamers, set sail for their last great rallying point on the face of the earth.
This is the story told about gold in South Africa, of how one or another European discovered it in the late 1800s, and how the precious metal would transform South Africa forever. And it did. The gold rush supercharged the development of the region, and Johannesburg became the economic hub of the continent, attracting thousands of fortune seekers from all over the world. None of whom actually went to the northern lime works in Taung, because here there's no gold, but the much less glamorous lime.
So when they blast out blocks of gold-bearing rocks, they want to separate the other rock from the little piece of gold.
This is geologist Rineke Wey. Her article in the South African Journal of Science is about the connections between mining history and the Taung Child.
And we specifically looked at the geology and mining history and the impact of that on what we know about the fossils and where we're at in the field today.
Which brings us back to gold and how to extract it from the rock it is embedded in.
And for that they used cyanide, and to control the pH they needed something like lime. So that's what they extracted from Taung to use this for this gold purification.
So without the gold in Johannesburg, it's very unlikely that anyone would have blasted all those cliffs in Taung.
without the mining activity, we maybe wouldn't have known about the fossils, and that would have meant a huge gap in our understanding of early human evolution.
From the outside, it's like brick building, 2 small windows and a door, then a corrugated iron roof.
And let's walk in to see how it actually looks from the inside.
We are in the village Buxton in Taung, at the site where the Taung Child was found, at the defunct Northern Limeworks mine, with guide Mike DiChaba, who grew up right here around the corner. The mining compound stretches out on the outskirts of the village. It's thoroughly institutional, like a school, an army barracks or prison.
I think the first thing that we should do is to start counting how many beds we have here.
Okay.
So we would have
1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. It's a lot of beds in a very small space. More like a prison cell, on enclosure for animals. 4, 35, 36, 37. Is that correct?
37 years, yeah. You would be correct, but I think you would be one down.
Oh, 38.
Yes,
yeah.
38.
And the room is about, what would we say, 40, 50 square meters or something like that?
Most probably.
Yeah.
Yes.
Seems like an incredibly uncomfortable bed. Concrete, hard concrete.
Yeah, in today's times, this would be a total violation of human rights.
There's a reason the place reminds me of a school or a prison. Because besides mining, it had another purpose: population control. Here is Stephanie Baker.
And the idea that kind of underpinned these compounds, and they genuinely are called compounds, is that it was a place where we could hold a large group of people who we consider a threat but simultaneously need.
Young black men whom the government feared would organize and rise up would be employed at the mines and housed far away from their home and communities. This was the so-called migrant labor system that broke up families and kept hundreds of thousands of men under tight control in inhumane conditions.
They sit in these rooms that are just chock-a-block full of people. The housing conditions themselves are not great. So they're living in abhorrent conditions.
Without special permission, movement was restricted to the compounds. No matter one's skill level, if you are black, you're classified as unskilled labor. Here's Reneke again.
They also did a lot of the dangerous work. I think during the 20th century, nearly 70,000 men have died during this mining activity.
A huge group of men made immense sacrifices to dig up gold for others to own.
So there's a big group who have been crucial to this mining activity and also to the discovery of the fossils.
But the credit for the discovery of the Taung Child was reserved for someone else. Here's paleoanthropologist Dipuo Khotleng.
The whole narrative that comes with that discovery, it makes zero mention of anybody else except for the colonial masters of the mining business, the people who were heading the anatomy department as well.
Everyone Dipuo mentions has at least one thing in common. They were not there when the Taung Skull was discovered.
There were mine workers, there were people who were working on the mines, who were working the ground. Zero mention of that.
The stories told about famous fossils usually begin when they are held by a scientist. But even today, this is not how excavation is done.
I mean, currently in South Africa, we have laborers. We have laborers that we utilize to extract these materials from the site with the assistance, with the guidance of the scientists. However, there are laborers who are employed, who are part of that scientific process, whether we acknowledge them or not, but they are there.
In Taung in the 1920s, people were there too, workers from across southern Africa. But we don't know much about them.
They become these unheard and unseen voices. It's like they never even existed.
It wasn't Raymond Dart who first held the fossil. It was almost certainly a mine worker. But in reality, we are left to imagine. So this is what I imagine. It's midsummer of 1924. A mine worker in Taung is digging through limestone, recently blasted out of the earth, when he notices something strange embedded within one of the blocks. I say he because this job is almost exclusively done by men. Black men. Maybe he's a local Setswana speaker, but he could have been from anywhere in southern Africa. Sweat's dripping off his forehead on this hot, cloudless day. Lean but strong, muscled arms reach down and pick up the block. He turns it over in his calloused hands. Does he know this rock is special? He's here every day. He understands rocks. He must know, because he picks it up and passes it on, making the first decision, leading to a scientific breakthrough and glory for another man, Raymond Dart. Whether the mine worker was ever told that he was instrumental in changing the understanding of human evolution is very doubtful. The history books are blank. But the credit of the discovery must at the very least be shared with one of the millions of mine workers of South Africa, on whose backs so much was built.
I grew up in Buxton, where the Taung Skull was found. I played in Buxton. We used to roll ourselves down those lime ash heaps, sometimes slide using boxes as young children.
Mike Dichaba spent his childhood playing on the huge lime ash heaps right here where the Taung Child was found. And yet, he'd never heard about it. Until one day as a young adult, when he came across a newspaper article with an intriguing headline.
The heading was titled "The Missing Link." And that's when I started to kind of pay attention to say, what is actually the missing link? Why the Taung Child skull?
The missing link. I remember being as fascinated with the concept growing up as Mike Dichaba was. What could such a creature look like? It's not an accurate way to describe evolution. It's pretty problematic actually. And if you hang on to the end of this episode, I'll give you a better metaphor. But it is a fascinating image that immediately grabbed the attention of young Mike and changed his life.
And an old man said to me, "Don't you know that Buxton is where the Taung Skull was discovered?" I was like, okay, what is Taung Skull? And then they could not answer. And reading the article, there are names like De Bruin, there are names like Professor Raymond Dart, there are names like Professor Philip Tobias, and I don't know these people. I'm reading this paper. It makes a lot of sense to me. It draws my interest.
Mike's interest in the Taung Child eventually led him to train as a tourist guide with special knowledge about the fossil and its history. He feels deeply connected to the distant relative who roamed the same area as he did as a child. But he also says that the community here feels sidelined, cut off from their own history.
Do you think that there should be that, like the descendants of the miners, they should benefit?
Absolutely.
And it isn't just Mike who feels this way. That the community where the fossil was found has been cut out of history. And later in this show, you'll hear how this plays out in the village today. But exclusion isn't new. It's been central to the Taung story from the beginning. Or, to be specific, the sidelining began 12 years before the Taung Child was even found. There were no explosions when another fossil was found in December 1912, far away from Taung. In a gravel pit in Piltdown in Sussex, England, an amateur archaeologist by the name of Charles Dawson made a series of remarkable discoveries. He said an unknown worker had given him the fragments of a skull, and later he himself found parts of jawbone, a tooth, stone tools and other fossils in the gravel. And the bone fragments were extraordinary. They looked like they belonged together.
They looked alike, they looked like they came from the same material, was amazingly human, except that it was missing the parts that articulated with the mandible. So what had been broken away on the skull was the attachment site where the mandible fitted into on the base of the skull.
This is physical anthropologist Alan Morris describing what was found in Piltdown 12 years before the Taung Child.
And here were these amazing fossils which showed a mixture of ape-like and human-like traits.
It seemed like Charles Dawson might have discovered the holy grail of fossil hunters at the time.
The missing link between humans and apes, because it carried traits from both.
And here it is again, the missing link. Inaccurate, but easy to imagine. And back then, it was a very big deal to have possibly found it.
And it was earth-shattering at the time, because now Britain had a fossil. Not only did they have a fossil, it had its own scientific name. It was Eoanthropus, which means dawn man. That's even better than having a Neanderthal in your back garden. This is something really important because this is right down at the roots of humanity.
But this was not what it seemed. The reason the skull and jaw appeared to be half human and half ape was because it actually was. It was a fake, a fabrication. The skull was human, probably a few hundred years old, and the jaw was from an orangutan. But at the time, the scientists and the world were fooled. When Piltdown Man was quote-unquote discovered, the search for human origins was still a fairly new discipline. But the idea that humans had evolved in Africa had actually been suggested before. Here's Krista Kuljan.
In the late 1800s and the early 1900s, paleoanthropology was a fledgling field, right? And in 1871, Charles Darwin published The Descent of Man, where he wrote that he thought it was likely that all humans had common origins in Africa. Darwin's hunch, if you will. But his theory was not widely accepted at the time. And that's really because scientists were arguing that humans had evolved in Europe or perhaps Asia.
In spite of Darwin's hunch, scientists believed humans originated in Europe or in Asia.
And that belief was influenced by the false assumption that many scientists had that Europeans were superior to other people around the world, and that there was a hierarchy of race.
In a perfect feedback loop, the idea that humans had evolved in Europe or Asia meant that this was also where all the scientists went looking for ancient human relatives.
And they found Neanderthal fossils in Germany and Belgium and France, and others were looking in Asia, but no one was looking in Africa.
You're not going to find a fossil where you aren't looking. And no one was looking in Africa, let alone in Taung. Even in 1912, there were questions around Piltdown Man. Not everyone was convinced that the jaw and skull belonged together, but the critics were drowned out. in spite of some pretty clear indications that all was not what it seemed. Take the so-called tools found nearby, for example. Here's Alan Morris.
When you look at the photograph, there's no question this has been shaved with a sharp metal knife. This is not stone tool work. This is not flaked and chipped. It's shaped with clearly a sharp blade.
One of them was a piece of elephant bone, stained to look like it belonged with the other bones. It became known as the cricket bat. And while I don't think anyone seriously believed that the Piltdown Man played cricket, it says something about the mindset of the scientists. Here's paleoanthropologist Lauren Schroeder.
And why not have early evidence for a cricket bat? When you look at all of these narratives, the quote-unquote scientific theories at the time it was such a dogmatic time and space that all of these researchers, all of the evidence that they found, whatever they were studying, had to fit within these very specific theories. Yeah.
They had it upside down. They went out to look for evidence for things they already believed.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. They use science as a form of giving power to the stories.
A powerful history at the time was of the superiority of the British Empire during the height of colonialism. European powers were competing for world dominance at the expense of the rest of the world. And Britain was ahead on most fronts, but they didn't have a fossil of a human ancestor. That is, until Piltdown Man made Sussex the cradle of humankind. Here is Alan Morris.
It's 1912. And it fits perfectly. It's exactly what the British wanted. Evidence to show that early humans, and again, the wording is important, first appeared in our country.
So this is the backstory. When a letter arrived at the offices of Nature on St. Martin's Street in London, the leading scientific publication in 1925. The letter was from Raymond Dart in Johannesburg, and it was a bombshell. Here's Krista Kuljan.
So by the time Dart described the Taung Skull in Nature in February 1925 and suggested, like Darwin had, that humans had their origins in Africa, his scientific peers in Europe were completely skeptical.
In the letter, Raymond Dart described the Taung Skull in detail and suggested that this was an entirely new species. Here's paleoanthropologist Rebecca Ackerman.
The Taung Child was small, right, and had a small brain, and was also bipedal, or he argued that it was bipedal, and was walking on two legs. And so he was essentially arguing that this small-brained, small-bodied biped in Africa was a human ancestor.
It wasn't just Piltdown Man that stood in the way of the recognition of the Taung Child. The fossil also challenged the timeline of evolution as it was understood then.
The thinking was that that large brain was like the thing, the powerhouse that drove human evolution and was first. And the Taung Child did not fit into that model at all.
What Dart suggested was that bipedalism, walking, came first, and that the large brain only followed later. And then there was the location of the discovery: Africa.
There was very much a racism kind of aspect to this. And, the notion of humans having evolved and the pinnacle of becoming human being European was very palatable to the people in Europe, whereas the idea of humans having evolved from Africa and Africans was not palatable at all.
Besides all of this, the Taung Child was, well, a child.
And there were a lot of arguments that were made that perhaps if it grew up, it wouldn't look as human-like as it does when it's a child. And we see this when you look at, ape, like a little chimpanzee baby, for example, looks a lot like a human, and then it grows up and looks like a chimpanzee. So there was that argument too, that the child thing kind of didn't help.
And finally, Raymond Dart did something else that might have rubbed the scientists in London the wrong way. He kept the fossil.
He didn't actually send the fossil or take the fossil to Europe for everyone to see it. He kept it here in South Africa and didn't circulate it. And so, without being able to kind of assess it on their own, a lot of those scientists, again, didn't take it very seriously.
While Raymond Dart did eventually take the fossil to Europe, he kept it in South Africa for a while, which, according to Rebecca Ackerman, was about more than simply being contrarian.
One of the things that, of course, he did do was to center African as the origin of humanity, right? And he fought for that, and that this really was a human ancestor, and that human evolution really did occur in Africa. He was complicated, and so there were definite positives to the way that he approached the Taung Child in that respect, in the centering of Africa, and in trying to put a little bit of the power in the South African context,
Raymond Dart's boldness did not pay off. People did not believe him, accept the Taung Child as a human ancestor, or Africa as the birthplace of humanity. And in hindsight, it makes sense. Because they already had Piltdown Man, a human ancestor that was found where they believed a human ancestor should be found, had a large brain like they expected, and did not challenge the ingrained beliefs of the scientists and society. But all of that was, of course, because Piltdown Man was a forgery made by someone who held all those same beliefs. And it would take decades of research and a new world order before the hoax was finally exposed. But eventually, the story did fall apart. Here's Krista Kuljan.
In 1953, more than 40 years later, when more advanced chemical tests were available, the fossils were found to be a forgery.
Dr. Kenneth Oakley of the British Museum of Natural History applied an entirely new method of dating fossils.
So, Piltdown Man Hoax Exposed was the headline in the New York Times.
Now there you are, skull, jaw, tooth, tools, and animal remains, all fraudulent.
At any rate, you can see so many things are intertwined and tangled in.
So many things are intertwined and tangled, like Raymond Dart said himself. And some of those we'll dig into in the next episode. Because during the decades where the world rejected the Taung Child, Raymond Dart did not only fight for Africa's place in evolutionary history. He also found himself entangled with an increasingly disturbing South African political reality. Racial segregation was on the rise and apartheid was coming closer. And Raymond Dart became part of a deeply problematic chapter of scientific research. And that's the topic of the next episode of this show. But before then, I've got a promise to keep. I promised you a new metaphor. Remember how everyone 100 years ago were looking for the missing link? The hybrid man-monkey that connects us to the apes. You've all seen the cartoon of the March of Progress, which, according to Rebecca Ackerman, is not only inaccurate.
It's got so many things that are wrong with it. Not only is it linear, you've got an ape-like thing going to a slightly stooped person, to a less stooped person, to on and on until it ends with, someone sitting next to a computer, right? That's the contemporary one. But it always ends with a European man, too. Almost always ends with a European man.
The other thing that's wrong with it is that evolution isn't linear like that. It's based on an old idea of hierarchy that scientists have long known is wrong.
That got replaced, maybe not in the common iconography, but it got replaced in scientific terms by the idea of something more like a tree, a branching tree. And that, over time you get something that evolves and branches and you get new species, and then those branch and you get new species. But at the end of the day, the tree is a little inaccurate too, because first of all, if you think about it, if you get lots and lots of branching through human evolution, but there's only one of us at the end, you really are still tracing a single line through there, right?
So neither a ladder nor a tree.
But now, the science that we have now, and a lot of this comes from understanding the variation in fossils, but also things like ancient DNA has give us a lot of information on that, tells us that neither a linear model nor a tree is really fully accurate, and that our understanding of our evolutionary past is more like a braided stream.
Imagine a spring. Water flowing down a gentle slope. The stream meets an obstacle, like a rock, and divides into two.
So, yes, you have the divergence of streams, and you have some that trickle off on the side and disappear, but you have ones that come back together again and reform.
The water in this metaphor is, of course, our evolutionary history. Small groups of ancestors drift apart, evolve separately. Some meet again later, others disappear entirely, like a trickle of water vaporizing on dry sand.
And that's come from, like I said, things like ancient DNA and fossils, but it's also come from our understanding of how evolution works, that it happens through adaptation and mutation, of course, which people are pretty familiar with, but that it also happens through sort of chance divergence of groups, so something we call genetic drift, and also through gene flow. We often talk about that as hybridization, so lineages coming back together.
Over millions of years, humans and our ancestors have separated, disappeared, found each other and separated again. And at the end, there's us.
I think this model of thinking about a stream is really powerful because, it's not only is it true and it tells us about human evolution, but it also really emphasizes the fact that discrete groups of people have never been a thing, right? We have been mixing and intermingling and passing genes between each other and, again, migrating and doing all this stuff for a very, very long time.
The reason I asked Rebecca for this new metaphor is to try to make sense of what happens next in the story. Raymond Dart and his contemporaries had a different view of evolution. The old idea of progression and missing links in a neat timeline.
Whereas, the idea of something like a braided stream breaks down a lot of those hierarchies, and it breaks down this idea of progress because it's just a much messier, it's biology, right? Biology is messy. Biology isn't this, things progressing and moving through evolution. We know that's not how evolution works. Evolution, again, it's like chances and migrations and genes flowing between groups and some things adapting well and some things not being able to adapt and they die. And right, it's a messy world that biology gives us. It's not a nice, tidy progress to the end.
But for Dart and the others, it was as if evolution had a goal. And that goal was producing the colonial era European man, who was destined to rule over everyone else. A worldview that had the built-in justification of all kinds of exploitation, some of it done by the scientists themselves, not least Raymond Dart, as you'll hear about in the next episode.
He had the power to make it happen, which sometimes break my heart when power relationship comes in, where somebody have power and then the others are inferior. They don't have the power to do anything. And I think this power that I had ruined a lot of people's life.
My name is Rasmus Spitz, and this is a production by ARC together with the Human Evolution Research Institute at the University of Cape Town. This episode is written, sound designed, edited and mixed by myself and Neil Liddell, based on original research from the special issue of the South African Journal of Science, the Taung Child Then and Now, commemorating its centenary in a post-colonial age. Special thanks to Bahidile Mike Dichaba. Don't forget to subscribe to the ARC channel so you don't miss the next episode. If you like this story, please share it with someone you like.